The kennel door shook like something inside it wanted to tear the walls down. 7 days. That's how long the 110-pound Belgian Malinois had refused food. 7 days of handlers retreating with bleeding forearms. 7 days of a dog that had survived 3 combat deployments slowly destroying himself from the inside out. The euthanasia order sat on the desk of Hargrove Medical Center's administrative director. Already signed. Sunset. That was the deadline. Then a soft-spoken nurse named Mara Weston walked through the front entrance carrying nothing but a worn canvas bag, and the dog stopped growling before she even reached the hallway. Nobody on staff knew why. Nobody knew who she really was. If this story already has you holding your breath, stay with me until the end. Hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning had started like every other morning at Hargrove Medical Center in the mountain city of Delworth, Colorado. Nurses cycling through shift change, the cafeteria running low on coffee before 8 a.m., and somewhere in the East Wing Rehabilitation Corridor, a dog that sounded like it was dismantling its kennel one steel bar at a time. Mara Weston heard it from the parking lot. She paused at her car door, head tilted, listening. The sound wasn't random aggression. There was a pattern to it, a rhythm of impact and pause, like something working through a problem rather than losing its mind. She'd heard that sound before, in a different life, in a different kind of facility. She knew what it meant. She grabbed her bag and walked inside. The East Wing of Hargrove was technically a transitional care unit, one of 3 buildings on a campus that served both civilian patients and a small but expanding military contract population. Veterans recovering from surgeries, soldiers cycling through physical rehabilitation, the occasional specialized case that the VA system flagged for overflow placement. The military K-9 had arrived 6 days ago under those overflow protocols, transferred from a regional veterinary facility after 2 handlers were injured during attempted examinations. His file had been flagged. His behavioral status was listed as critical. His name was Dax. The nurses on the East Wing had started taking the long way around. Mara stopped at the break room, poured herself the last of the morning coffee into a paper cup, and stood at the window overlooking the corridor junction. She could see the door to the kennel room from here, a reinforced room that had originally been designed for medical equipment storage before the military contract added it to the facility's scope. Through the narrow window panel beside the door, she could see the kennel itself, heavy-gauge steel anchored to the wall, and currently shaking in steady rhythmic intervals. "You the new per diem?" A voice behind her. She turned. A male nurse in green scrubs, thick-set, early 40s, the kind of permanent tiredness around his eyes that comes from years of rotating shifts. His badge read Cole Draper, RN. "Yeah," Mara said. "Mara Weston. I'm covering the East Rehab unit this week." Cole glanced toward the kennel room window and back at her. "Then you're going to want to know right now. Don't go near that room. The dog in there has already sent 2 people to the ER. Staff isn't authorized to enter. Military vet team is supposed to come evaluate, but they keep pushing the appointment." "What's the plan if they keep pushing?" Cole's expression didn't change. "Director Aldrich put through a euthanasia recommendation yesterday. Waiting on final sign-off from the military liaison. They've got until tonight to call it." Mara looked back toward the window. Through the reinforced glass, she could see a dark shape moving inside the kennel. A dog pacing, not in the loose, unfocused way of an anxious animal, but with a tight, contained motion that tracked the room's perimeter. Methodical. Aware. "What unit was he with?" she asked. Cole looked at her differently then. "How'd you know it's a military working dog?" "Belgian Malinois, East Wing of a military contract medical facility, flagged behavioral status, euthanasia being coordinated through a military liaison." She took a sip of coffee. "And the way he's moving." Cole leaned against the counter. "Special operations. That's all I was told. His handler was killed in action 3 weeks ago. Dog got shipped back stateside, went through 2 different facilities before ending up here. Nobody's been able to get close enough for a full behavioral assessment." He paused. "His name's Dax." Mara nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else for a moment. She finished her coffee, crumpled the cup, and dropped it in the recycling bin. Then she picked up her bag and asked Cole where she could find the patient assignment board for the East Rehab unit. She spent the first 3 hours of her shift exactly where she was supposed to be. managing medication schedules for 4 post-surgical veterans, updating mobility assessment notes, fielding questions from a physical therapist named Gwen about a patient's range of motion progress. She was good at her job, efficient. She didn't waste words and she didn't waste motion, and the staff around her clocked quickly that she wasn't the type to need hand-holding. At 11:15, she walked to the kennel room door. She didn't open it. She stood in the corridor outside it, approximately 6 feet back, and she waited. 30 seconds into it, the rhythmic impact sound from inside stopped. She heard Dax move. The soft shift of weight, pause against the kennel floor, repositioning, then quiet. She stood there for another 4 minutes. Then she walked back to the nursing station. She requested Dax's records at 12:30. She did it calmly, the way she did everything, filling out the access request form at the nursing station computer and submitting it through the facility's internal system. The form required her to identify her clinical role, the reason for the request, and her supervisor. The reply came in 11 minutes. Request denied. Military behavioral records are restricted to authorized liaison personnel. Please direct inquiries to Administrative Director Harlan Aldrich's office. Mara printed the denial, folded it in half, and put it in her bag. She went back to her patients. At 2 p.m., Harlan Aldrich appeared in the East Wing hallway. He was a tall man, well put together in the way of administrators who are very conscious of looking like administrators. Pressed slacks, a collar that fit too well, the kind of deliberate posture that fills a doorway. He had the record access denial response in his hand, which meant someone on his team had flagged that a per diem nurse had submitted the request and decided it was worth his personal attention. "Ms. Weston," he said. She looked up from a chart. "Director Aldrich, I understand you submitted a records request for the K9 unit." "I did." "That access is restricted." "Your system told me that." He paused, recalibrating slightly. He'd expected more friction than that. "The animal's situation is being managed through the military liaison. It doesn't fall within the clinical scope of the East Rehab Unit staff." "Understood," Mara said. Another pause. "Is there a reason you're interested in the case?" She looked at him steadily. He had good instincts underneath the administrative polish. She could tell he was actually reading her, not just going through the motions of a corrective conversation. That made him more careful than she'd initially assumed. "I work on the East Wing," she said. "I heard the dog. I asked about the case. When I found out there was a euthanasia timeline on a military working dog, I requested his records because I thought I might be useful." She held his gaze. "I didn't know the request would reach your desk personally." "Everything in this wing reaches my desk personally," Aldrich said. "This facility runs on a military contract that requires strict information management. I need every staff member, including per diem, to understand that." "I understand it." "Good." He turned to go, then stopped. "The evaluation is scheduled for this evening. Until then, I'm asking you to stay away from the kennel corridor." Mara nodded. "Of course." He left. She watched him go, then turned back to her chart. She went back to the kennel corridor at 3:45. She didn't open the door. She sat down on the floor of the hallway, back against the wall beside the kennel room entrance, legs stretched out in front of her, and she did nothing. No phone, no chart, no sound. She ate half a granola bar from her bag and stared at the water-stained ceiling tile directly above her. From inside the room, she heard Dax move again. That repositioning sound, weight shifting on the floor. Closer to the door this time. A passing orderly gave her a look. She didn't acknowledge it. 15 minutes in, a pair of doctors came through the corridor. The taller one, silver hair, the easy authority of someone who'd been senior staff long enough to make it involuntary, clocked her sitting on the floor and slowed down. "Can I help you?" he said, in the voice of someone who doesn't actually mean that question. "No thanks." "You're the per diem nurse?" "Yes." He glanced at the kennel room door. "Aldrich told staff to stay clear of this area." "He asked me to stay away from the kennel corridor, Missy," Mara said. "I'm in the corridor. I'm not in the kennel." The doctor stared at her for a moment. His colleague, younger, smarter eyes, the kind of resident who was always quietly calculating, pressed his mouth flat to avoid a reaction. "This is a waste of time," the senior doctor said. Maybe, Mara said. She settled back against the wall. He made a sound of dismissal and kept walking. From inside the kennel room there was a soft thud. Not the hammering impact from before, but something settling. The sound of a large animal lying down. Mara closed her eyes for a moment. There you go, she thought. At 4:50, Cole Draper found her still in the corridor. He stood over her with his arms crossed, the expression of a man who was genuinely trying to decide whether to be exasperated or impressed. Aldrich's going to hear about this. He probably already has. The evaluation team is coming at 6. Military personnel. They're going to want the corridor clear. I'll be clear by 6. Cole looked at the kennel room door. Is it quieter in there? Since about 4 o'clock. He crouched down against the opposite wall, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the tired honesty of someone who'd stopped performing professionalism for the day. What are you actually doing? Sitting. Why? Mara thought about how to answer that. When a dog's been through what that dog's been through, lost his handler, lost his unit, transferred 3 times in 3 weeks, strangers keep coming at him with equipment and restraints, every interaction he has teaches him something. Right now, everything he's learned in the last 3 weeks is that people approach and things get worse. She looked at the door. So I'm teaching him something different. Cole was quiet for a moment. You have a background in animal behavior? Some. He nodded, a long, slow nod that meant he understood she wasn't going to elaborate. Aldrich's going to escalate. The military liaison has been pushing for a resolution. If the evaluation tonight goes badly, I know. They could move up the timeline. I know, Cole. He stood up, looked down at her. I'm not going to tell you to leave, but I'm also not going to be able to help you if Aldrich pulls your credentials. I'm not asking you to help me. He left. She stayed. From inside the room, she could hear Dax breathing. Slow, steady, the rhythm of an animal that had stopped fighting for a moment. She sat with that sound for a long time. The evaluation team arrived at 6:15. There were 3 of them, a military veterinarian in uniform, a behavioral technician, and a uniformed officer who stayed near the door and said nothing. They moved with the efficiency of people who had done this before and didn't enjoy it. Clipboards, assessment forms, a transport case that contained sedation equipment. Aldrich was with them. He looked at Mara as she stood to get clear of the corridor, his expression flat and professional, giving nothing away. The military vet, Captain someone, Mara didn't catch the name, entered the kennel room with the behavioral technician. What happened next took approximately 90 seconds. Dax went from lying down to vertical so fast it looked edited, throwing himself at the kennel with a force that rocked it against the wall anchors. The tech stumbled back. The vet held her ground but barely, and her clipboard hit the floor. They retreated. The door shut. In the corridor, nobody spoke. Then the uniformed officer said quietly, Assessment outcome, behavioral risk unmanageable. Proceeding to recommendation is filed. Aldrich looked at Mara. There was something in his face that wasn't quite satisfaction, more like the specific relief of a man whose paperwork was about to go through uncomplicated. Ms. Weston, he said, I'll need you back at the nursing station. She looked at the kennel room door. Now, Aldrich said. She went. Eat. She stayed at the nursing station for 40 minutes. She updated charts. She answered a patient call. She refilled a water pitcher. She did her job, exactly as she was supposed to, and she didn't say anything to anyone about the evaluation or what happened after it. At 7:20, she checked her phone under the nursing station counter. The message had come in at 7:04. Encrypted. No sender name, just a string of routing codes she recognized the format of, from a long time ago in a version of her life she'd spent 8 years learning not to reference in conversation. She read it twice. Weston. Dax ID confirmed. Phantom Fang line 7. We know where you are. Do not let them execute the dog. T. She locked her phone and put it back in her pocket. Cole was at the far end of the station, updating a chart. He didn't look up. The corridor was quiet. Through the distant wall she could hear nothing from the kennel room, which meant Dax had gone quiet again, which was both better and worse depending on what it meant. She stood at the nursing station counter and thought about how quickly things could move when the wrong sequence of decisions got locked in. 90 seconds in that room. That's all it had taken. 90 seconds of a traumatized animal reacting the only way he knew how, and a team of people who read that reaction through a framework of risk management rather than behavioral history. And now there was a timeline in motion that had its own momentum. She thought about this message. Phantom Fang Line 7. 3 words that shouldn't exist in a text on an encrypted channel sent to a nurse working a per diem shift at a transitional care facility in Delworth, Colorado. 3 words that told her exactly who had sent it and exactly what they knew, which meant they knew more than they should about where she was and what was happening here, which meant someone had already been watching this situation before she walked in this morning. She pulled out her phone again and typed a single-line reply. Timeline? The response came in 4 minutes, 48 hours. Be ready. She stared at that for a moment. Then she put the phone away and walked back toward the east wing. What? She was halfway down the corridor when she heard Aldrich's voice from around the corner. He was on the phone, speaking in the clipped, professionally modulated way of someone reporting rather than conversing. She slowed. The evaluation is conclusive as far as the liaison is concerned. I've already confirmed with Dr. Orville that the order can move forward at 8 a.m. tomorrow. A pause. No, the nurse is a per diem. She has no authority over the case. Her interest in the file is... Another pause. Longer. I'm not concerned about that. The access request was denied through proper channels. She doesn't have the clearance to access those records, and frankly, she doesn't have the context. Mara stood still in the corridor. The facility's obligation to the contract is a clean resolution, Aldrich continued. A dog that can't be assessed is a liability. We move forward tomorrow morning. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw her standing there. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Miss Weston. His voice was even. Whatever he'd felt at seeing her there, he'd already packed it down. Director. I believe your shift ends at 8. It does. I'd suggest you make use of the time. He held her gaze for a moment, not quite a warning, not quite anything she could name, and then walked past her toward the administrative wing. She turned and watched him go. In the kennel room, behind a steel door at the end of the corridor, Dax was quiet. She took out her phone and looked at the message again. 48 hours. Be ready. Tomorrow morning was less than 12 hours away. She walked back to the kennel room corridor and sat down on the floor again. This time, she stayed until the night shift came on. Aset, the night charge nurse, a compact woman named Petra, who had the organized efficiency of someone who'd been running nights so long she'd stopped experiencing them as abnormal, found Mara in the corridor at 9 p.m. and looked at her for a long moment before saying anything. Cole told me about you, Petra said. What did he say? That you sat here for 2 hours this afternoon and the dog went quiet. Petra glanced at the kennel room door. He's been quiet since the evaluation team left. That's the longest stretch since he arrived. Mara nodded. Petra crossed her arms. Aldrich has the morning order confirmed, 8 a.m. I know. Is there anything you can actually do before then? Mara looked at the door. I need access to his training records. Not his behavioral assessment. His training records. The program he was part of. Petra's expression shifted slightly. That's above my access level. I know. But I need you to know that those records exist and that they're going to matter. She looked up at Petra. If someone from the military contacts this facility tonight or tomorrow morning, someone above the liaison level, I mean a direct contact from a special operations command, I need you to not let Aldrich shut that conversation down before it happens. Petra stared at her. You're telling me you have a contact inside special operations? Mara didn't answer that directly. I'm telling you the situation isn't what the evaluation made it look like. And if the right people get here in time, the order won't go forward. And if they don't get here in time, then I need you to stall. Petra stood there for another moment, studying her. Something shifted in her face. Not quite trust, not quite the opposite. The pragmatic recognition of a night nurse who'd spent long enough in this work to know that official processes sometimes needed a human hand on the brake. I'm not going to do anything that puts my license at risk, Petra said. I'm not asking you to, but I'm also not going to rush anything either. Petra looked at the kennel room door one more time. I'll take my time with the morning paperwork. That's all I'm saying. That's enough, Mara said. Petra went back to the night station. Mara settled against the wall. The building had gone to its nighttime register. The soft mechanical sounds of a facility at reduced staff, HVAC cycling, a cart moving somewhere on the floor above. The corridor was dim, half the overhead switched to low power mode. From inside the kennel room, she heard Dax shift again. The slow, heavy movement of a large animal rearranging itself. Then the breathing. That same rhythm she'd heard that afternoon. Slower now. Closer to the door. She pressed her palm flat against the wall beside the door frame. "I know," she said quietly. Not performing it, not projecting, just saying it. "I know what happened. I know who you lost." The breathing on the other side of the door didn't change. "I'm going to need you to hold on a little longer," she said. "Can you do that?" Silence. Then, from directly behind the door, a single sound. Low. Not a growl. Something else entirely. Mara closed her eyes. 8 a.m. was coming, and the message on her phone said 48 hours. But she didn't have 48 hours, and whoever had sent that message needed to understand that the timeline had already moved. She pulled out her phone and typed again. "They're moving at 800. Whatever you're doing, do it faster." She hit send and stared at the dark screen of the corridor. The clock on her phone read 9:47 p.m. She had 10 hours and 13 minutes. And somewhere in this building, Harlan Aldrich's signed order was sitting in a folder on a desk, waiting for morning. She reached into her bag and pulled out the denial notice she'd printed earlier, the one from Aldrich's office. Request denied, military behavioral records are restricted, and looked at it for a long moment in the low corridor light. Then she folded it in half again and put it back. She wasn't going through the records request system again. She needed a different door. She needed a different door. The problem with that thought was that the only doors she actually had access to at 9:47 on a Tuesday night in a half-staffed transitional care facility were the ones that had already been closed. The records system had shut her out. Aldrich had made his position clear. The military liaison had filed its paperwork and was presumably somewhere doing something that wasn't answering encrypted messages from per diem nurses. What she had was a phone, a building she'd only been in for one shift, and a dog that had gone quiet on the other side of a reinforced door. She stood up from the corridor floor, worked the stiffness out of her lower back, and walked to the night nursing station. Petra was at the computer, entering notes, doing it with the focused quiet of someone who'd learned to treat the night hours as their own particular territory. She looked up when Mara appeared. "I need to know who the military liaison is," Mara said. "Not the title, the actual person, name and contact." Petra looked at her for a moment. "That goes through Aldrich's office." "I know. I'm not asking you to call Aldrich's office. I'm asking if you personally have a name." Petra's expression told her that she was calculating something. Risk on one side, the specific wait of 10 hours and 13 minutes on the other. Then she reached for a small, spiral-bound contact directory that lived beside the desk phone, the kind of physical backup that facilities kept because digital systems went down and people still needed to reach people. "His name is Major Dennis Falk," Petra said without looking up. "He's the contracting liaison for the military units placed at this facility. He's also—" She paused. "Not particularly easy to reach after hours." "Does that directory have a direct number?" Petra turned 2 pages, read something, turned it so Mara could see it without physically handing it over. Mara photographed the page with her phone. "I didn't show you that," Petra said. "Show me what?" Petra turned the directory back around and went back to her notes. Mara walked down the corridor to the small family consultation room at the end of the east wing, empty at this hour, lights off, 2 upholstered chairs and a box of tissues on a side table. She closed the door, left the lights off, and called the number. It rang 6 times. She was composing the voicemail in her head when it picked up. "Falk!" The voice was alert for 10 p.m. Either he'd been awake or he woke up fast. "Major Falk, my name is Mara Weston. I'm a nurse currently on staff at Hargrove Medical Center in Delworth. I'm calling about the K9 unit currently housed in the East Wing, dog-designated Dax." A pause. "Who gave you this number?" "I found it." Another pause, longer. "Ms. Weston, the assessment on that animal was conducted this evening by a qualified military veterinary team. I know, I was in this building when it happened. The assessment took 90 seconds, Major. The dog reacted to an approach by unfamiliar personnel in a clinical setting 3 weeks after losing his handler in theater. That's not an assessment. That's a trigger confirmation. I'm not going to debate protocol with a... He stopped himself, started again. The recommendation has been filed through appropriate channels. The execution order is scheduled for 8 a.m. tomorrow, Mara said. Before that happens, I need you to pull Dax's full training program records. Not his behavioral assessment, his program records. The unit he was assigned to, and the program he was trained under. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. She could feel him recalibrating. Why? He said finally. Because if you pull those records and read them, you'll understand why a 90-second assessment in a corridor tells you nothing meaningful about that dog's actual behavioral state. And you'll also understand why the euthanasia recommendation was premature. Ms. Weston, I'm not asking you to cancel the order tonight. I'm asking you to read the records before you let it go forward. That's all. She kept her voice level. No performance, no urgency she couldn't afford. If you read them, and you still think the recommendation stands, I'll stop calling. Another long pause. She heard him exhale. I'll look at the file, he said. It wasn't a commitment, but it wasn't a door closing either. Thank you, Major. He hung up without responding to that. She sat in the dark consultation room for a moment, phone still in her hand. Then she went back to the corridor. She didn't sleep. She hadn't planned to. What she did instead was move between the nursing station and the kennel room corridor in slow, deliberate rotations, sitting with Dax for 40 minutes, checking in at the station, sitting again. Petra stopped commenting on it after the second rotation. By midnight, the building had settled into its deepest nighttime register, and the only sounds were mechanical ones. At 12:40, her phone buzzed. The encrypted channel. Records confirmed. Phantom Fang. Falk has been contacted from above his rank. There are people moving. Stay with the dog. She read it 3 times. From above his rank meant someone had made a call that jumped the liaison level entirely. That was a faster move than she'd expected, and it meant whoever had sent her the first message wasn't just watching from a distance. They had active reach inside a command structure that could pick up a phone at midnight and get results, which opened a question she didn't have time to sit with right now, about who exactly was watching and how long they'd been watching and why they'd waited until she was already inside the facility to move. She put the phone away and went back to the kennel corridor. At 1:15, she heard something different from inside the room. Not the breathing, not movement, a low sound, barely audible, on the edge of register. She went still, listened. It came again. Dax was whimpering. Not the aggression sound. Not the defensive sound she'd heard in the corridor when the evaluation team entered. This was something underneath all of that. Something that belonged to a different layer of the animal entirely. The grief layer. The one that came out at 3 in the morning when the performance of survival got too heavy to maintain. She pressed her back against the wall next to the door and stayed there. I know, she said again, the same way she'd said it before, quietly. Not trying to reach through the door, just letting the sound exist in the same space. I know it doesn't make sense yet, that he's gone and you're here and nobody around you speaks your language. The whimpering continued for another minute and then stopped. She stayed for another hour. Chat. At 2:50 a.m., Harlan Aldrich walked into the East Wing. She heard him before she saw him. The specific heel strike cadence of someone who walked like their authority preceded them, even at 3 in the morning, even in a building they presumably hadn't planned to be in at this hour. He came around the corner in slacks and a collared shirt that looked fresh enough to suggest he hadn't been asleep, and when he saw her sitting on the corridor floor, his expression did something complicated and then settled into a flatness she recognized as the controlled version of anger. Ms. Weston. Director Aldrich. He looked at his watch. A deliberate gesture, making sure she understood he was noting the time. It's nearly 3 a.m. Yes. Your shift ended at 8. I'm off the clock, she said. I'm sitting in a hallway. You're sitting in a restricted corridor in a facility you're contracted to work in as a per diem nurse, and you called the military liaison tonight using contact information that is not publicly available. His voice was measured, but something underneath it was not. Major Falk called me at 11:30. I would have expected him to. He told me the records were being reviewed at the request of someone above his command level. Aldrich paused on that. Do you want to tell me who contacted his command? No. His jaw tightened. You need to leave this building. I'm not on duty. I'm not interfering with any active care. I'm sitting in a hallway. She met his eyes. You can ask me to leave and I'll note that you asked. But I'm going to need you to be very specific about what facility rule I'm currently breaking, because I intend to remember this conversation clearly. The silence between them had weight in it. He was smart enough to know that what she'd just said was also a very specific kind of message, that she was establishing a record of this moment, that she was paying attention to the precise language of every exchange, that she understood the difference between what someone could do and what they could document. The order goes forward at 8 a.m., he said. Whatever calls were made tonight, whatever records are being reviewed, the behavioral assessment stands and the order is active. Then I'll still be here at 8, Mara said. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through options: call security, have her physically removed, and create a paper trail of a director forcibly removing a nurse from a hallway at 3 in the morning over a dog that was still alive. Or leave her here and deal with whatever the morning brought. If you interfere with the execution process, he said quietly, I'll have your per diem credentials pulled from every contracted facility in this region. Noted, Mara said. He left. From inside the kennel room, there was a sound. Brief, low. Not a whimper this time. Dax had heard the voices in the corridor, and whatever he'd registered from the exchange had reached him somehow, the specific frequency of tension in human voices that working dogs learn to read better than most humans read each other. Mara exhaled slowly. 6 hours. Dawn came the way it always did in the mountains. Not gradually, but suddenly, the light changing quality rather than degree, the sky going from black to a deep charcoal to something that was almost blue before the sun had technically cleared the ridge. She was aware of it through the east wing's narrow corridor window, a rectangle of changing gray that she watched between rotations. At 6 a.m., the morning shift began arriving. Cole came in at 6:15 and stopped in the hallway when he saw her, the expression on his face doing several things simultaneously. Did you sleep at all? No? Mara, I know. He stood there for a moment, looking at the kennel room door. It's been quiet in there all night? Mostly. He had a hard stretch around one. Settled after that. Cole rubbed the back of his neck. There's something going on in administration. I heard Aldrich was in the building at 3 in the morning. He was. And? And he confirmed the 8 a.m. timeline. Cole looked at her directly. Is there anything that's actually going to stop it? She was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was that she didn't know. She knew that messages had been sent and people had moved and records were being reviewed, and she knew that the person who'd sent her 48 hours last night had moved faster than that. But she didn't know how fast was in the context of a military command structure that had its own momentum and its own paperwork and its own definitions of urgency. I don't know yet, she said. Cole nodded slowly. He disappeared toward the morning briefing and came back 20 minutes later with a cup of coffee, which he set on the floor beside her without saying anything, and then went to his patients. She drank it. At 7:15, Petra appeared at the end of her night shift wearing her coat and carrying her bag, and she walked the length of the corridor to where Mara was sitting and stopped. The morning paperwork is going to be slow, Petra said. You said that last night. I'm saying it again. Petra's face was tired in the specific way of someone who'd been awake all night making small decisions that added up to something larger than any one of them. I can slow the intake process on the order documentation, maybe 30 minutes. That's the most I can do without it becoming something I can't explain. 30 minutes might be enough, Mara said. It might not be. She didn't say that part. Petra left. The East Wing was filling up now. Morning shift nurses, an early physical therapy tech, the ambient sounds of a facility reactivating. Someone had turned on lights in the corridor that had been on low power all night, and the sudden brightness felt abrupt, like being interrupted mid-sentence. At 7:40, her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Not the encrypted channel this time, a standard call, a number she didn't recognize, Colorado area code. She answered, Ms. Weston. The voice was male, precise, with the particular economy of speech she associated with people who spent a lot of time giving orders. My name is Colonel Renner Graves. I'm calling from the Special Operations Command Administrative Office in Colorado Springs. She stood up. I understand you've been in contact with Major Falk regarding a K-9 unit currently housed at Hargrove Medical Center. Yes, she said, and I understand you have a familiarity with the training program that Animal was part of. Yes. A pause. We've been looking at the records that were flagged last night. There are elements of this situation that weren't communicated to the liaison team, and there are questions we need answered before this morning proceeds. Another pause. I need to know your full background with the Phantom Fang program, Ms. Weston. She stepped away from the kennel room door and moved toward the end of the corridor, lowering her voice. What do you need to know? We pulled your service record. It's considerably more extensive than what the facility has on file for you. I left the service 8 years ago. You designed the behavioral architecture for the Phantom Fang K-9 training program, Graves said. It wasn't a question. Including the command sequences for the Line 7 units. Yes. And Dax is a Line 7 unit. Yes. The silence on his end had a different texture now, the kind that exists when someone is verifying something while the conversation continues. Ms. Weston, I need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. If we get you proper access to that animal this morning, not a 90-second corridor approach, actual access, can you give us an accurate behavioral assessment? She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Yes, she said. I can. Then I need you to stay where you are. I'm making calls. He hung up. She looked at her phone, 7:43 a.m., 17 minutes. She walked back to the kennel room door. Button. Aldrich arrived in the East Wing at 7:55 with the military veterinary captain from the previous evening and a facility security officer whose name she'd never learned. The captain carried the same assessment case. The security officer was there, she understood, specifically because of her. Aldrich saw her standing in the corridor and his expression went through something she couldn't fully read. He was a man who'd been operating on 3 hours of sleep and a situation that had started producing complications he hadn't accounted for, and the specific complication of her still being here and still standing had apparently not fully resolved itself in his calculations. Ms. Weston, he said, I asked you to leave. You said you would note if I interfered with an active care process. I haven't interfered with anything. I've been standing in a hallway. The military vet captain looked between them, uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who wanted to finish a professional task and was finding the interpersonal situation in the room poorly mapped. The order is active, Aldrich said. We're proceeding. I've been in contact with Colonel Renner Graves from Special Operations Command, Mara said. He's making calls. That landed. She saw it. The specific micro-adjustment in Aldrich's posture, the captain's expression shifting, the security officer going very still. That's, Aldrich started. He called me at 7:40, she said. 17 minutes ago. He asked me to stay on site pending his calls. A colonel does not have authority over this facility's administrative decisions, Aldrich said, but the certainty in his voice had changed slightly. It was performing certainty now rather than expressing it. No, she agreed. But he has authority over whether the military contract that funds this wing continues. The corridor was silent. And then Aldrich's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something passed across his face, very fast, very controlled, and then gone. He stepped away from the group and answered it. She watched his back. She couldn't hear what was being said to him, but she could read the shift in his shoulders, the way a posture changes when a conversation stops being an exchange and becomes something you're receiving. The call lasted 4 minutes. When he turned back around, his face was composed in the careful way of someone composing it deliberately. The execution order is suspended pending review, he said. His voice was even. Everything about him was even. Captain, your team won't be needed this morning. The captain blinked. Director, thank you for your time. Aldrich looked at Mara. Colonel Graves has requested that you be given access to the animal for a formal behavioral assessment. The facility will cooperate. He paused on that word in a way that made it sound like swallowing something. I'll need a full written report by end of day. He walked away without waiting for her response. The security officer followed him, apparently not sure what else to do. Mara stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the kennel room door. The captain cleared her throat. Ms. Weston, I'm Captain Yara Solis, military vet team. She extended her hand. Her expression had moved from uncomfortable to something closer to professionally curious. I understand you have a background with this unit's program. Some, Mara said. Would it help to have a vet present during the assessment? Mara considered. Yes, but you'd need to stay back and stay quiet unless I ask for something. The assessment isn't going to look like an assessment. Solis nodded slowly. What's it going to look like? A conversation, Mara said. That I have with him, not at him. She turned to the kennel room door. She went in alone first. The room was 12 by 15 feet, utilitarian, concrete floor, overhead fluorescents, the wall-anchored kennel taking up the far third of the space. There was a water bowl, currently full, and a food bowl with 7 days of untouched evidence. The smell of the room was what you'd expect. Confined animal, stress, the faint chemical edge of disinfectant over something organic and unhappy. Dax was at the back of the kennel, standing. He was watching her. He didn't throw himself at the door. He didn't vocalize. He stood with the contained, coiled stillness of a dog running a very rapid calculation. Threat level, familiarity, whether the pattern of this approach matched any pattern he'd encountered in the last 3 weeks. She didn't walk to the kennel. She walked to the middle of the room and sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and put her hands in her lap. She didn't look directly at him. She looked at a point on the floor about 3 feet to his left, present without being confrontational, aware without pressing. She'd done this before, a long time ago, with a different dog in a different room, and she'd learned it from a man who'd spent 30 years understanding how animals process threat versus safety, and who taught her that the worst thing you could do in a moment like this was perform calm rather than actually be it. So she breathed. She let her heart rate do what it was going to do, and she breathed with it rather than against it. And she looked at the floor, and she waited. 40 seconds. Then she heard the kennel floor. A shift. Weight redistributing. She didn't react. Another 20 seconds. Another shift. Closer to the kennel door now. She raised her right hand slowly to shoulder height, palm out, and held a hand signal. Nothing dramatic, just 3 fingers extended in a specific configuration that hadn't been part of any standard training manual, that existed only in the documentation of one program, that a dog trained in that program would recognize the way a person recognizes their name. The kennel went completely silent. Then the latch on the kennel door. The interior release she hadn't touched, that Dax had apparently figured out at some point in the last 7 days, clicked. The door swung open. She kept her hand up, kept her eyes on the floor. She heard him come out of the kennel, heard the soft, careful placement of paws on concrete, closer and closer. He stopped 8 inches from her knee. She lowered her hand slowly, turned it palm up. She felt the weight of his muzzle settle into her palm, not tentative, not aggressive, just there, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She exhaled. Behind her, through the door she'd left cracked, she heard Captain Solis make a sound that might have been involuntary. Mara closed her fingers gently around Dax's jaw and sat with him in the quiet of the room, in the particular aftermath of 7 days of a grief nobody had known how to name. The formal assessment took 2 hours. She didn't call them sequences or evaluations. She worked through them the way they'd been designed to be worked through, as a language, a back and forth, a system of signals and responses that had been built over 18 months of program development and that existed between this dog and the people who'd trained him as a form of genuine communication rather than compliance. Solis watched from the doorway with a notepad and said nothing, which was the right call, and Mara appreciated it. Dax wasn't broken. That was the clearest thing the assessment showed. He was grieving, and grief in a working dog with no outlet and no familiar language around him looked like aggression from the outside, looked like a liability, looked like a risk, looked like a recommendation filed through appropriate channels. But underneath the behavior that the evaluation team had seen last night was an animal whose training was entirely intact, whose responses were precise, whose fundamental trust in the system he'd been taught hadn't been destroyed. just buried under 3 weeks of loss and disorientation and the specific cruelty of being surrounded by people who kept trying to fix something they didn't understand. When she was done, she wrote the assessment summary in the consultation room while Dax lay outside the open kennel door with his head on his paws, watching the middle distance with the settled quality of an animal that had been allowed to stop performing distress. The summary was 6 pages. She didn't soften anything in it. She noted the training program. She noted what the behavioral profile of a Line 7 unit looked like under trauma stress, and how it differed from behavioral profiles that represented genuine aggression. She noted the specific gaps in the military liaison team's communication with the facility, the records that hadn't been provided, the context that hadn't been given, and she noted that the euthanasia recommendation had been made in the absence of information that would have materially altered it. She didn't name intent. She named absence. The report would do the rest. She was finishing the final page when Cole knocked on the consultation room doorframe. "There are military vehicles in the parking lot," he said. She looked up. 2 SUVs parked out front, people in uniform going into administration. Cole paused. "Aldrich's assistant has been in and out of his office 3 times in the last 20 minutes. Mara capped her pen. She looked at the 6 pages of the assessment. She looked at her phone. No new messages on the encrypted channel, no missed calls. Then she heard footsteps in the main corridor. Not the soft rubber-soled tread of nursing staff. Something heavier, more deliberate. Cole stepped back from the doorframe. 2 uniformed officers passed the doorway without looking in. And then a third person. A man in a military uniform with a bearing that didn't announce itself loudly, but occupied space in the specific way of someone who was used to rooms reorganizing themselves around him, stopped at the doorframe and looked at her. Colonel Renner Graves was shorter than his voice had implied. He had the compact, weathered look of someone who spent time outdoors in difficult conditions, and the kind of stillness in his face that came from learning to manage what showed up there. He looked at the 6 pages on the table in front of her. "Is that the assessment?" he said. "Yes." "Is the dog stable?" "Yes." He nodded once. "There are some things we need to discuss, Miss Weston. About this facility and about the decisions that were made here in the last 24 hours. He paused. "And about you." She met his eyes. "My office ran your full service record this morning," he said. "There was a significant gap between what the facility has on file and what we actually found." "I left the service 8 years ago," she said. "I didn't falsify anything. I just didn't volunteer it," he said. Not quite an accusation. "No." He studied her for a moment. "The records for the Phantom Fang program have your name on every core document. Behavioral architecture, training protocol, command sequence design." A pause. "Line 7 units were your design, specifically?" "Yes." "Then you understand why it matters that the person who designed that system was on site when this dog's euthanasia was being processed." She held his gaze. "Is that a question?" "It's going to become one," Graves said. "In about 10 minutes, when we go down the hall to the administrative conference room and have a conversation that Director Aldrich is currently being summoned to." He looked at the assessment pages again. "I'd like you to bring those." He stepped back from the doorframe, giving her room. She gathered the 6 pages. She thought about the last 18 hours. The corridor floor, the coffee Cole had set down beside her without a word, the sound of Dax at 1 in the morning when the grief came through. She thought about the message that had reached her on an encrypted channel from a sender she still didn't fully understand, and the word ready, and what exactly she was supposed to be ready for. She stood up. Down the hall, a door opened. She heard Aldrich's voice, a single syllable cut off, and then the kind of silence that means someone has just been told something they weren't expecting. She picked up her bag and walked toward the conference room. The conference room at Hargrove Medical Center was a room that had been designed for budget presentations and staff reviews. A long laminate table, padded chairs in institutional blue, a projector screen nobody had lowered in months collecting a faint skin of dust. It was not designed for what it was about to hold. Mara walked in and took a seat on the right side of the table, setting the 6 assessment pages in front of her. Colonel Graves sat at the head. With him were 2 officers she hadn't seen before. A woman in her mid-40s with the insignia of a JAG officer, and a younger man in plain clothes whose function wasn't immediately obvious, though the small recorder he placed on the table without announcing it told her something about why he was there. Captain Solis took a chair along the wall, slightly back from the table. Observer position. Aldrich came in last. He came in the way someone enters a room when they've had 60 seconds to compose themselves and used every one of those seconds strategically. Posture managed, expression managed, a legal pad under one arm that suggested he'd had just enough time to grab something that looked like preparation. He sat across from Mara without looking at her and placed the legal pad on the table. There was a fourth chair on his side, currently empty. Graves let the silence sit for a moment in that particular way of people who use silence as a calibration tool. Then he said, "For the record, this meeting is being documented as an administrative review under Special Operations Command's Facility Contract Oversight Authority. Director Aldrich, you've been informed of the basis for this review." "I have," Aldrich said. "I'd like to note that I'm here voluntarily and that I believe the facility has acted in full compliance with its contractual obligations." "Noted," Graves said. He looked at the JAG officer. "Major Devlin." The JAG officer, Major Devlin, Mara filed that, opened a folder. "Director Aldrich, the review this morning identified a gap in the information transferred to this facility regarding the K-9 unit designated DAX. Specifically, the unit's full training program records, including behavioral profile documentation for Line 7 program animals, were not included in the transfer packet when the dog arrived at this facility 12 days ago." Aldrich's expression stayed steady. "The facility received the documentation provided by the veterinary transfer team. Whatever was or wasn't included in that packet is a transfer chain issue, not an administrative decision made by this facility." "That's one way to characterize it," Devlin said. "It's the accurate way." Graves said, "The behavioral records that weren't transferred include a 58-page protocol document specifically addressing trauma responses in Line 7 units following handler loss. The document outlines a mandatory 45-day stabilization period before any behavioral assessment occurs." He paused. "The assessment that produced the euthanasia recommendation took place on day 12. Aldrich didn't move. "I was not informed of any mandatory stabilization window." "No," Graves said. "You weren't." "Which is the first question." He let that land. "The second question is why, when a member of your nursing staff identified a concern and requested records access, that request was denied rather than escalated. Per diem nursing staff don't have clinical authority over military contracted cases." "She didn't request clinical authority, she requested records access." Graves's voice remained even. The evenness was doing more work than volume would have. "Those are different things, Director." Aldrich pressed his mouth together. "The records are restricted to unauthorized personnel," Devlin said. "Ms. Weston's service record," she glanced at Mara briefly, "includes 8 years as the primary architect of the program that trained DAX. Her clearance level at separation was above the classification of the documents she requested." Aldrich looked at Mara for the first time since he'd walked in. It was a specific kind of look. Not rage, too controlled for that. Something tighter. The look of a man recalculating how much he hadn't known and what that meant for everything that had followed. "I had no way of knowing her background," he said. "No," Graves said. "You didn't." A pause. "But you did have a nurse raising a concern about a military asset under an active euthanasia timeline. And your response to that concern was to deny the records request, warn her off the corridor, arrive at the facility at 3 in the morning to confirm she was still there, and threaten her contracting credentials." He looked at his notes. "That sequence of decisions is what we're here to discuss." The room was very quiet. From somewhere in this building, a cart moved in a corridor, the ambient sound of a facility going about its morning. Mara looked at her assessment pages and waited. The meeting ran for 2 hours and 20 minutes. She spoke when Graves directed questions to her and not otherwise. She walked them through the assessment findings, the behavioral architecture of Line 7 units, what trauma response looked like against the baseline of the program's design parameters, what the assessment had shown, and what it meant for DAX's operational future. She was precise. She used the language of the program documentation rather than clinical softening, because precision served the record better than comfort served anyone in this room. Aldrich's questions. And he had questions. delivered through Devlin since he'd apparently decided that direct exchange with Mara was a posture he wasn't going to take, were consistently aimed at establishing that his decisions had been made on the information available to him. Which was true as far as it went. She didn't dispute it. She let the record speak to what the information had been and where the gaps had come from. At the end of the formal session, Graves asked the plainclothes officer to pause the recording. Then he looked at Aldrich and said, "The euthanasia order is formally suspended pending the outcome of this review. Dax remains at this facility under modified care protocols that Ms. Weston will provide to Captain Solis in writing. The review's findings will be shared with the facility's contracting board within 72 hours. Aldrich nodded. One sharp, contained motion. "There's a separate matter," Graves said, and his tone shifted in a way that wasn't dramatic but was noticeable. A gear changing. "The record's gap. We need to establish how the transfer packet was assembled and what decisions were made at each point in the chain." He looked at Aldrich directly. "That investigation will be conducted by Major Devlin's office. You'll receive a formal information request within 24 hours. "I understand," Aldrich said. "Good." Graves stood. The room stood with him. That automatic response to rank that happened before people decided to do it. "Ms. Weston, I'd like a word." Aldrich left without looking at her. Devlin and the plainclothes officer gathered their materials and gave them space. Solis moved toward the door and then stopped at a look from Graves, who apparently wanted her to stay. When the room was down to the three of them, Graves sat back down. Not at the head of the table this time. He pulled a chair around to her side and sat across from the assessment pages she'd written, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with an expression that had dropped the meeting posture entirely. "Chief Warrant Officer Weston," he said. "I've been a civilian for 8 years, Colonel." "I know. I'm using the title because the context earns it." He picked up the top page of her assessment and read the first paragraph again, though she suspected he'd already read it. "This is clean work. The program was designed to be accessible by anyone who knew it." "That's not what I mean." He set the page down. "I mean you came in here on a per diem shift, got shut out of every official channel, spent a night on a corridor floor, and still produced a 6-page behavioral analysis that is going to hold up to every level of scrutiny we put it through." He paused. "Why didn't you identify yourself to the facility when you arrived?" She thought about how to answer that. "I wasn't here as the person who designed the program. I was here as a per diem nurse. That's the job I took. And if you hadn't been the person who designed the program, if you'd just been a per diem nurse with no other background, the order would have gone through at 8 this morning." "Yes, that concerns me more than almost anything else in this file," Graves said, "that the outcome depended on a specific person with specific history happening to be on shift." He looked at Solis. "Captain." Solis said, "The communication gap in the transfer protocol is documented in 3 prior cases involving Line 7 units. Different facilities, different circumstances. In 2 of those cases, the outcomes were," she paused, "not recoverable." Mara looked at her. "How many units are in the field currently?" 11 Line 7 animals, Solis said. "If one of them loses their handler, they go through the same transfer process Dax went through," Mara said, "with the same documentation gap." The room absorbed that. "Which means the issue isn't this facility," Mara said. "The issue is the transfer protocol itself. The 58-page document isn't being packaged with the animal." "Correct," Graves said. She looked at him. "Is that why you're here personally? Because this isn't just about Dax." He held her gaze for a moment. "Partly," he said. "The other reason I'm here personally is because whoever sent you that encrypted message last night used a channel that runs through my command. And I'd like to know who in my staff was monitoring your location and decided to activate you without going through me." She was quiet. "You don't know," he said. "It wasn't quite a question. The sender identified as T," she said. "The routing codes were from a format I recognized from my service years. I don't know who specifically." Graves exchanged a look with Solis that Mara couldn't fully read. "We'll find out," he said. He stood again. "In the meantime, I need you to continue the rehabilitation protocol for Dax. Formal authorization, full facility access, reporting directly to Captain Solis. Are you available?" She thought about the per diem schedule she'd been managing and what it would take to restructure it, and whether any of that mattered against what he was asking. "Yes," she said. Good. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was brief and direct, no performance in it. Thank you for not leaving last night. He left. Solis lingered. She looked at Mara with an expression that was professionally composed around something more complicated. The two prior cases, Mara said, the line 7 animals. One was euthanized. One was reassigned to non-operational duty based on an incorrect assessment. Solis paused. Neither of those facilities had someone who knew the program. Mara looked at the assessment pages on the table. I'll write up the modified care protocol this afternoon, she said. The East Wing functioned differently once the authorization went through. It wasn't that the staff changed how they treated her. It was more that the texture of their attention changed, the slight adjustment that happens when people recalibrate what category to put someone in. Cole was the most honest about it. He stopped by the kennel room doorway mid-morning and stood watching Mara work through the second session with Dax, and then said, when she came out, "You want to tell me what your actual background is?" "Not particularly." "That's what I figured." He thought for a moment. "Are you actually a nurse?" "RN since 2019, military medic before that." "And before that?" She looked at him. "I designed training programs." He nodded slowly. "For dogs." Among other things. He seemed to accept that as the complete version of what she was going to give him. "Aldrich's been on the phone with the facility's legal counsel since the meeting ended," he said. "Just so you know." "That's his right." "Yeah." Cole crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. "There's also something going around among the staff that nobody's said directly yet, which is that a couple of people think you went outside the facility's chain of command and made contacts you shouldn't have made, and that this whole situation got bigger than it needed to be." She looked at him. "I'm not saying I think that," he said. "I'm saying you should know it's circulating." "Who's saying it?" He hesitated. "Britta Solano, day shift charge nurse on East Wing. She's been in Aldrich's corner since before I started here." He paused. "She also specifically requested that the per diem assignment for this week go to someone with no special operations background." Mara went still. "That's what she requested," Cole said carefully. "Whether that was just general preference or something more specific, I don't know. But after this morning, I thought you should know she made that request before you arrived." "How do you know what she requested?" "Because I was there when she told the staffing coordinator. I didn't think about it at the time." He met her eyes. "I'm thinking about it now." She looked down the corridor. Dax was visible through the kennel room window, lying near the front of his enclosure in a relaxed posture that would have been unrecognizable to the staff who'd dealt with him for the first 12 days. "Where is Solano now?" she said. "Staff lounge. She's on break." Mara picked up her care protocol notes from the nursing station counter. "I'll need to speak with Colonel Graves's office about something," she said. "Can you let Captain Solis know I'll be delayed by about 20 minutes? Cole uncrossed his arms. "Sure." He watched her. "Should I be worried?" "No," she said. "I just have a question to answer." She didn't go to the staff lounge. She went to the small records alcove off the nursing station, a narrow room with filing cabinets on 2 walls and a terminal that accessed the facility's internal scheduling and communications system. The system Aldrich's office had denied her access to yesterday morning was a different tier than the standard nursing staff system. The nursing staff system she'd had access to since she clocked in on her first shift. She logged in and pulled the staffing coordinator communications for the current week. The request was there. Solano to the coordinator, sent 8 days ago, 3 days before Dax arrived at the facility. Please ensure this week's East Wing per diem assignment does not include anyone with military specialty medicine or K9 handling background. General medical surgical experience preferred. 8 days ago, 4 days before the euthanasia recommendation was filed. She looked at that for a moment. Then she pulled Solano's facility communications for the prior 2 weeks and started reading. It took her 11 minutes to find what she was looking for because she knew roughly what she was looking for and the system wasn't large. An email thread. Solano to an external address, not the military liaison, not anyone she recognized. Sent 6 days ago, the same day Dax arrived. Asset is on site. Timeline is 12 days from transfer as discussed. The per diem coverage this week won't complicate things. She read it twice. Then she photographed the screen with her phone, went back to the terminal's print function, and printed 3 copies of the thread. She stood in the records alcove with the 3 copies in her hand and thought about the shape of what she was looking at. Solano had known Dax was coming 4 days before he arrived, had made arrangements to ensure the staff coverage during his time at the facility wouldn't include anyone with relevant background, had communicated with an external contact, someone outside the facility, outside the standard military liaison chain, about a 12-day timeline. The euthanasia recommendation had been filed on day 12. She folded the 3 copies, one in her bag, one in the outer pocket of the care protocol folder. One she walked down the hall and left at the nursing station with a note to Cole that said only, "Hold this for me. Don't mention it to anyone yet." Then she called Graves's office on the number she'd saved from his morning call. He answered on the second ring. "There's a staff member here you should look at," she said. "Charge nurse, East Wing, named Britta Solano. I'm looking at communication records that suggest she had prior knowledge of Dax's transfer and took steps to limit the kind of staff coverage that might interfere with the euthanasia timeline." She paused. She also communicated with an external contact I can't identify from the facility system. The address is routed through what looks like a personal account, a silence on his end that she'd learned to read as the colonel processing at speed. "Send me the screenshots," he said. She texted them from the hallway. "Where is she now?" he said. "Staff lounge as of 15 minutes ago." "Don't approach her. Don't let her know what you found." A pause. "Is she aware of the morning meeting?" "She's on the East Wing. She knows the order was suspended. She may not know why." "All right." His voice had changed register again. The meeting tone was gone, replaced by something more operational. "I'm sending Devlin. Keep this between you and whoever you've already told." "One person. He'll hold it." "Good." He paused once more. "Weston." "Yes." "The external address. Did you get any part of it?" She thought about the screenshot. "Partial? Ends in a domain I don't recognize. I'll text you the full string." She pulled up the photo and sent it. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then, "I know that domain." She waited. "It belongs to a private contracting group that has bid on several military K-9 program contracts in the last 2 years. Unsuccessfully because the Phantom Fang program outcompeted them." He said it with a flatness that made it more significant, not less. "They've been looking for ways to demonstrate that the program has operational liabilities." She stood in the hallway and let that settle into its full shape. A working dog with a deceased handler transferred to a facility with a corrupted information chain, assessed on a timeline that had been engineered to produce a specific outcome. An outcome that would generate documentation, an official euthanasia recommendation, that could be used to argue that Line 7 units were behaviorally unmanageable following handler loss. "They needed the record," she said. "They needed the paperwork," Graves said. "A euthanasia recommendation filed at a contracted military medical facility carries institutional weight. It becomes part of the program's official behavioral incident documentation, which they could use in the next contracting bid, which they could use everywhere." His voice was precise and cold in the way of someone who'd arrived at the same conclusion some hours ago and had been building a case around it since. "Devlin is on her way. Stay visible and stay on the East Wing." He ended the call. She put the phone in her pocket and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the kennel room door at the end of the corridor. Through the narrow window panel, she could see Dax, still in his relaxed position, head on his paws, the undemonstrative stillness of an animal that had stopped bracing. She went back to him. Major Devlin arrived at Hargrove at 11:40 with a second JAG officer and a digital forensics specialist whose equipment case was the most expensive-looking thing in the building. They went directly to Aldrich's office, which meant Aldrich was pulled back into something he hadn't anticipated, and the ripple effect of that moved through the East Wing staff before lunch. Mara watched it the way she watched most things, from a slight distance, paying attention without appearing to. Solano was at the nursing station at noon when Devlin appeared in the East Wing doorway and asked to speak with her privately. Mara was at the far end of the station, updating Dax's care notes on the terminal, and she kept her eyes on the screen. She heard Solano say, in a voice that was very well controlled, "Of course. Let me just finish this note." She heard the few seconds of silence that followed, which was the specific silence of someone deciding how to handle a moment they'd been hoping wasn't coming. Then Solano set down her pen and walked toward the doorway. Cole appeared at Mara's elbow 60 seconds later. "What just happened?" he said, low. "Investigation," she said. "Don't ask me more than that right now." Aldrich's legal counsel is in the building. Devlin's team is in admin, and now Solano's being... "Cole." He stopped. She looked at him. "I know it's a lot. Give it a few hours." He exhaled, nodded, went back to his patients. The afternoon moved slowly and quickly at the same time. The paradox of a situation that contained both too much waiting and too much happening. Mara worked through Dax's afternoon session, which she kept shorter than the morning, letting him set the pace. His appetite was coming back. She'd documented it in the care notes and told Solis, who'd photographed the food bowl for the medical record with the focused attention of someone building an evidence file. At 2:15, Solis found her in the hallway outside the kennel room. "I just came from Graves," Solis said. "The forensics team pulled Solano's full communication history from the facility system. There are 14 exchanges with the external address going back 4 months." Mara looked at her. 4 months? She said. "Before Dax was even assigned to this facility. Before his handler was killed." Solis kept her voice steady, but something in it wasn't. The original plan was a different Line 7 unit. The handler deaths changed the target, but the operation was in motion before that. The hallway felt different after that, smaller. The water-stained ceiling tiles and the institutional lighting and the faint chemical smell of the corridor doing nothing to accommodate the size of what had just been said. "They were waiting for a handler loss," Mara said. "They knew statistically it was a matter of time." Solis met her eyes. "There are 11 Line 7 animals in the field. The program operates in high-risk environments. Handler loss is part of the operational reality," Mara said. "Yes." She thought about the program she'd built. 18 months. The behavioral architecture, the command sequences, the specific design philosophy that a working dog was not a piece of equipment, but a cognitive and emotional partner, that the system had to account for the full range of what that meant, including what happened when the partnership ended. She'd written the 58-page protocol specifically because she knew that moment would come, had known it was the most dangerous transition in a working dog's life, had tried to build a bridge across it. The bridge existed. The problem was someone had been making sure it didn't reach the other side. "Graves is escalating this above the contracting level," Solis said. "This is going to be handled at a command level, Mara. Solano is not the end of this." "I know." "Aldrich, I know." She looked at the kennel room. How much of what Aldrich did was knowing and how much was being used, Solis said. "That's what Devlin is trying to sort out." The communication chain from Solano to the external contact didn't run through Aldrich directly, but the decisions he made, blocking the records request, the 3 a.m. visit, the credential threat, those decisions served the timeline whether he knew it or not. "Is that a defense?" "It's a complication." Solis paused. "It means his culpability depends on what he knew and when he knew it. And that's not going to resolve quickly." Mara was quiet for a moment. She thought about Aldrich's face when she told him Colonel Graves had called, the way it had moved before he'd controlled it. She thought about whether that movement had been fear of the situation or fear of something he'd been part of. She still didn't know. She wasn't sure the distinction mattered as much as the outcome. "What happens to Dax?" she said. "He stays here under the modified protocol until his behavioral evaluations clear the threshold for reassignment. Graves wants you on site for the full rehabilitation period." "How long?" 4 to 6 weeks, depending on progress." She nodded. That was manageable. She'd already been calculating it. "There's one more thing," Solis said. She hesitated in a way that felt unusual for someone Mara had watched operate with precise, unhesitating professionalism for the last 8 hours. "The person who sent you the encrypted message, T. Graves said his office was going to find them. They did." Solis looked at her. "It was Sergeant First Class Dax's last handler, Sergeant Tomlin Reyes." She paused. "He didn't die in the action report." Mara looked at her. The KIA notification was a processing error, a documentation failure in a mass casualty situation. 3 soldiers were misidentified in the initial report. Solis's voice stayed level. "Sergeant Reyes is alive. He's been in a medical facility in Germany for the last 3 weeks recovering from injuries sustained in the same engagement." She paused. He's been trying to find out what happened to his dog. The hallway was very quiet. Mara looked at the kennel room window. She could see Dax's dark shape through the glass, still in that resting position, head up now, watching something she couldn't see from her angle. She thought about the message. Do not let them execute the dog. T, sent from Germany, at whatever hour it was in Germany, by a man with injuries serious enough to hospitalize him for 3 weeks, who'd found a way into an encrypted channel to reach someone he'd apparently researched far enough to locate at a per diem shift in Delworth, Colorado. When is he being transferred stateside? She said. His medical team is evaluating that now, potentially within the week, depending on his recovery status. Solis paused. Graves is looking at whether this facility's rehabilitation unit could be his transfer destination. Mara looked at her. Reyes would need to know Dax's behavioral status, Solis said. He'd need to know whether... He's ready, Mara said. You're certain? She looked at the window. Dax had moved. He was at the kennel door now, standing, nose against the gap at the bottom. The posture of a dog that had heard a conversation in a corridor and was paying attention to it with everything he had. He's been ready since last night, Mara said. He just needed someone to speak his language long enough for him to believe it was safe to come back. She watched him at the door, and that was the moment she noticed what Dax was reacting to. Not her voice, not Solis's, but a sound from the main entrance corridor. A specific cadence she wouldn't have caught without the context she now had. Wheels on a hard floor, the sound of a wheelchair or a medical transport moving through an entrance. Solis's phone buzzed. She looked at it and went very still. She looked up at Mara. Graves moved faster than he told me, Solis said. Reyes landed at Denver International 2 hours ago. From the kennel room, a sound she hadn't heard Dax make in the entire time she'd been here. A sharp, escalating vocalization. Not distress, not aggression. Recognition. The sound of an animal that had just registered something in the air of the building that didn't belong to grief or fear or the exhausting performance of being alive without a reason. She was already moving toward the main corridor when she heard the doors at the East Wing entrance open. And then she stopped, because the person coming through those doors in a transport wheelchair, left arm in a full cast, face carrying the specific grayness of someone 3 weeks out from serious trauma, was not alone. With him was a compact female officer pushing the chair and a medical escort in travel scrubs, and a man in plainclothes she didn't recognize. But the man in the wheelchair had his eyes on the far end of the corridor, fixed on the kennel room door, and the expression on his face was the kind that doesn't organize itself into something a person can keep entirely private. And from the kennel room, behind a steel door at the end of the hall, Dax was making a sound that climbed and climbed and climbed. Mara stepped to the side of the corridor, and then she saw the plainclothes man more clearly. The one she didn't recognize. The one who was watching her with the expression of someone who'd known exactly who she was before he walked through that door. He wasn't military. He wasn't medical. His suit was the kind that federal offices used for field personnel, and the badge clipped to his belt was the kind that opened doors that had nothing to do with special operations contracting reviews. He reached into his jacket and produced a second badge, a paper credential, laminated, the kind that served as a supplementary identification when the first one needed context. He held it out to her. She took it, read it. Her hand stopped moving. The credential identified him as a senior investigator with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and the investigation number printed at the bottom of the credential was dated 4 months ago. 4 months. The same window as Solano's communications with the external contact, which meant the Inspector General's office had been running a parallel investigation into the contracting group and their attempts to compromise the Phantom Fang program, for the same 4 months that the operation against Dax had been in motion, which meant someone had known this was coming and had placed her here. She looked up at the investigator. "Miss Weston," he said, "my name is Agent Harlan Voss. We have a great deal to discuss." Down the corridor, the kennel room door was shaking. The credential was laminated and slightly warm from being inside his jacket, and Mara held it longer than she needed to because her brain was doing several things simultaneously, and one of them was buying time. 4 months. The IG investigation had started 4 months ago. The same window as Solano's first communication with the external contact, which meant someone in the Inspector General's office had been watching the contracting group move pieces into position and had watched them do it, and documented it, and not stopped it. She handed the credential back. "You let it run," she said. Voss took the credential without breaking eye contact. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent a career listening to things people said when they thought they were in control of a conversation. "We needed the full chain. Stopping it early would have given us Solano and maybe one other contact. Letting it run gave us the contracting group's internal structure, their financing, their communication architecture, and the names of 3 other facilities where similar operations were in early stages. And Dax," she said. "Dax was always the risk we couldn't fully manage," Voss said. He said it without apology, which she respected more than she would have respected the other thing. "We had the operation covered at every node except the execution point. We didn't anticipate the euthanasia timeline moving to day 12. Because someone built the timeline with margin to spare, and then Aldrich accelerated it. The evaluation team was scheduled for day 14. Aldrich moved it up when you flagged the case. Your records request created pressure he responded to by compressing the window." Voss paused. "Which is why your being here mattered more than we planned for." She looked at him. "You planned for me being here at all? We identified you as the optimal person to recognize what was happening with Dax if you encountered the situation. We didn't plan the mechanism. We facilitated the per diem assignment." The corridor was very still. Behind her, she could hear the wheelchair. Behind the kennel room door, Dax was still vocalizing. That climbing sound that had no distress in it, only urgency. "You put me here," she said. "We made you available," Voss said carefully. "You showed up and made every decision yourself." She thought about the encrypted message. Weston. Dax ID confirmed. Phantom Fang Line 7. "We know where you are. Not a surprise, not a coincidence, a placement." She'd known something was off about it when she read it. She'd filed it and kept moving because she hadn't had the time to sit with it, and because it didn't change what needed to happen. She filed it again now for the same reason. Down the corridor, Sergeant Tomlin Reyes had gone very still in the transport wheelchair. He was staring at the kennel room door with the focused, arrested quality of someone who had been waiting for something so long that the actual arrival of it had temporarily suspended all other function. "He needs to see the dog," Mara said. Voss stepped aside. She walked past him down the corridor. She spoke to the medical escort first, a travel nurse named Ortega, who had the organized calm of someone who'd done long-distance patient transport enough times to have strong opinions about it. Reyes's injuries: left arm, 2 fractured ribs, a moderate TBI that was 10 days past the acute phase and currently expressing as fatigue and occasional word retrieval problems, neither of which was going to matter in the next few minutes. His vitals were stable. He'd been ambulatory with assistance for the last 5 days. "Can he stand?" she said. Ortega looked at her. "Technically, yes. We've been keeping him in the chair for transport because I know why. I'm asking if he can. With support." She went to Reyes. He looked up at her when she crouched beside the wheelchair. Close up, the grayness in his face was more specific. Not just fatigue, but the particular exhausted quality of someone who'd been fighting towards something for a long time on inadequate resources. He was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 30, 31. The cast on his left arm went to the elbow and had a few marks on it that looked like they'd been made with a pen cap in the specific pattern of someone who'd been doing something repetitive to stay occupied. "Sergeant Reyes," she said. "Yeah." His voice was slightly rough. The word retrieval problem Ortega had mentioned showed in the half-second lag before it, the small effort. "I'm Mara Weston. I'm the one who's been with Dax." He looked at her with an expression that did several things very fast. "Is he... He's okay. He's good. He's been waiting." She paused. "He heard you come in." Reyes looked at the door. His jaw tightened in the specific way of someone managing something they're not going to perform for an audience. "Can you help me up?" he said. She looked at Ortega, who gave a short nod. She positioned herself on his right side and let him use her arm as a brace, and he stood the way someone stands when standing costs something. Deliberate, slightly slow, fully committed once he started. He was about 6 feet and had the build of someone who'd been athletic before 3 weeks in a hospital bed, and he was steadier on his feet than the chair would have suggested. She walked with him to the kennel room door. She had a decision to make in about 4 seconds about whether to prepare him for what the room looked and smelled like, or whether that information would help anything. She decided it wouldn't. She opened the door. Dax came off the kennel floor so fast it looked like a single motion. From lying to airborne, the full weight of a 110-pound working dog hitting Reyes in the chest and driving him back 2 steps. Mara caught his right arm. He caught the dog with both, cast and all, and she heard him make a sound she wasn't going to remember the details of because it wasn't the kind of sound that should be remembered in detail. It was private. She looked at the door frame instead. Behind her, from the corridor, she heard Ortega, and then the sound of the transport wheelchair being carefully, quietly moved further down the hall, giving them the space. She stepped back and left the doorway. Voss was waiting for her at the nursing station. Solis was with him, and Graves had reappeared from wherever he'd been for the last hour, and the 4 of them stood in the cluster that forms when people have things to say and a finite amount of time to say them. The IG's office is taking the lead on the contracting group, Graves said. He said it directly, which told her there had been a jurisdiction conversation between him and Voss in the last 20 minutes that had reached its conclusion. The facility review stays with Devlin. The staff-level decisions and Aldrich's role are hers. What about Solano? Mara said. Voss answered. She's been formally detained and is being interviewed now. The external communications we pulled are enough to open federal charges, contract interference, potentially conspiracy given the scope. That determination is above my pay grade, but the file is strong. And the contracting group? We have the financial records, the communication chain, the names of their internal contacts at 3 other facilities. Voss said it with the flat confidence of someone reading from a checklist that was nearly complete. Their bid for the next Phantom Fang contract cycle was due in 6 weeks. It's not going to be submitted. Cole appeared at the edge of the group with the expression of someone who had been managing his own patients and overhearing fragments of other people's situations all morning and had reached the limit of managing both simultaneously. Can someone tell me what's happening in plain language? Nobody answered immediately, which answered it for him. Okay, he said. He went back to his patients. Mara looked at Graves. What do you need from me for the rest of today? A written statement for Devlin's record, your account of the record's access denial, the corridor conversation with Aldrich, the 3 a.m. exchange, and the communication records you found on the facility system. He paused. And the full technical documentation of the modified care protocol for Dax, in a format that can be distributed to any facility that receives Line 7 animals going forward. That second one is going to take longer than today. I know, take the time you need. The first one, I can have it by 4. He nodded. She turned to go and Voss said, Ms. Weston. She stopped. There are going to be questions about your role in this, he said, from Devlin's office, from the IG review, and from the facility's legal counsel, who is going to argue that your actions outside your contracted scope created liability. He paused. I want to be direct with you about that. I appreciate the directness, she said. The IG's office will provide documentation of our operational awareness and the basis for your per diem placement. That should address most of the liability argument. But the process is going to take time, and it's going to involve depositions and formal interviews and administrative reviews that are... He paused, picking the word, not brief. Is that a warning or a description? A description, he said. You're not in trouble. You are going to be inconvenienced significantly. Noted, she said. She went to write her statement. Da. The statement took 3 hours because she wrote it the way she wrote clinical documentation. Precise, sequential, attributed to observable facts rather than inference, and complete enough that someone reading it without any prior context could reconstruct the full sequence of events from her perspective without filling in any gaps themselves. It ran to 11 pages. She wrote it in the consultation room, door closed, on a legal pad Devlin's office had provided. And she didn't stop except once when Cole knocked to tell her Reyes had been settled into a room in the rehabilitation unit 2 floors up, and that Dax had been moved into a modified kennel space in the same unit under Solis's supervision, and that both of them appeared to be, in Cole's words, significantly less destroyed than they were this morning. She thanked him and went back to the statement. At 4:15, she brought it to Devlin, who read the first 3 pages while Mara waited, and then looked up with the expression of someone recalibrating their estimate of a situation. I'll need you available for follow-up questions, Devlin said. I know. The facility's legal counsel has already filed a preliminary objection to the IG's characterization of the per diem placement. They're going to argue that you were operating outside your contracted scope regardless of the IG's involvement. I know that too. Devlin looked at her for a moment. You seem very calm about all of this. Mara thought about the corridor floor at 9:47 p.m. She thought about the coffee Cole had set down beside her without a word. She thought about the sound of Dax at 1 in the morning, and the message that said 48 hours, and the 7 days of untouched food in a bowl that no one had thought to ask the right questions about. I've been calm about worse, she said. Devlin accepted that and went back to the pages. Aldrich was still in the building at 5 p.m. She became aware of this when she passed his office and saw the door open and the legal counsel, a man named Fenn, who she'd seen arriving that morning with a rolling briefcase, seated across from Aldrich's desk, while Devlin's second officer stood near the window with a tablet. Aldrich was at his desk, and whatever was happening in that room had been happening for a while. His jacket was off. The legal pad he'd carried into the morning conference was on the desk with more writing on it than she'd seen him put there during the meeting. She didn't slow down. But she saw his face as she passed, not because she was looking for it, but because he looked up at the exact moment she was in the doorframe sightline, and the expression she caught was one she hadn't seen on him before. The other expressions had all been managed. This one was a man in a room where the managing had stopped being sufficient. She kept moving. At 5:30, Solis found her in the hallway outside the second-floor rehabilitation unit. Devlin found something in Aldrich's emails, Solis said. She kept her voice low. Not for anyone else's benefit, Joyce. The hallway was empty, but because the information seemed to carry its own requirement for quiet. Not external communications, internal ones, between Aldrich and Solano going back 2 months. Mara looked at her. They weren't coordinating the external operation, Solis said. The emails make that clear. Aldrich didn't know what Solano was doing or who she was doing it for, but they were coordinating something else. She paused. There's a pattern of Solano flagging clinical decisions to Aldrich with specific framing, cases where military staff or contractors raised concerns about facility protocols. The emails show Aldrich consistently responding by limiting those staff members' access or influence within the East Wing. She paused again. It's not criminal. It's administrative behavior that protected his authority, but it created the environment where the external operation could function. Solano knew how he'd respond to a per diem nurse raising concerns because she'd seen him respond to it before. She used him, Mara said. She used his instincts, Solis said. He's a man who responds to perceived challenges to his authority by limiting the challenger's access. She counted on that, and he delivered every time. Mara thought about the corridor at 3 a.m., the specific way Aldrich had appeared, the specific words he'd used. The facility runs on a military contract that requires strict information management. Not a lie, not fabricated, just a real thing, from a real person, deployed in a way that served someone else's purpose without him knowing it had been chosen. Does Devlin think he knew? She said. No, she thinks he was managed. Solis's expression was careful. Which doesn't clear him of the decisions he made, because those decisions had consequences regardless of his intent. But it changes the nature of his culpability. He threatened my credentials, Mara said. I know. At 3 in the morning. I know. That'll be in Devlin's findings. Solis looked at her. He's also been cooperative this afternoon in a way that suggests he understands what the emails show, that he was used by someone who worked for him, and that the outcome of that is going to be professionally significant regardless of intent. Mara said nothing for a moment. She thought about what it was like to understand that something had moved through you without your knowledge and used your own instincts as its mechanism. That the thing you thought you were protecting, your authority, your contract, your carefully managed facility, had been the handle that someone else used to do damage. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she understood the specific quality of the terrible thing he was sitting with in that office. What happens to him? She said. He'll likely be removed from the position. The threat to your credentials alone is a terminable action under the facility's own employment policies. The administrative record that Solano built, the access denials, the restrictions, those go in his file. Solis paused. Whether there's anything beyond termination depends on what Devlin's office determines about the extent of his awareness. Mara nodded. She looked at the door to the rehabilitation unit. "Can I go in?" she said. "Reyes asked to see you an hour ago," Solis said. "I told him you were finishing your statement." The rehabilitation room was standard issue. 2 beds, currently 1 occupied, a window that faced the mountain ridge line, afternoon light coming in at the specific low angle of a Colorado late afternoon in early fall that made everything look slightly more significant than it was. Dax was in a modified rest space that Solis's team had set up as along the room's far wall. A padded mat, a water bowl, a boundary that existed more as a suggestion than a barrier, because a Line 7 animal in a recovered state didn't need barriers, it needed orientation. Reyes was on the bed with the head raised, in hospital clothes, the cast still visible, looking considerably less gray than he had in the wheelchair. Some of that was the room. Most of it was the 110-pound dog who was currently using his leg as a pillow. He looked up when she came in. "You wrote the program," he said. "Not an accusation, just landing on it." "Yes." "The 58-page protocol." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at Dax. "I read it. When I was assigned. A lot of handlers don't bother with the theory sections. I did." He paused. "That's why I knew what was going to happen to him if—" He stopped, started again. "The KIA notification. When I found out it went out, I was in Germany. I couldn't—" He closed his eyes briefly. "I called every number I had. Half of them didn't work from a German hospital line. The ones that did work took 2 days to get through to anyone who knew what was happening with him." "T," she said. "Why T?" He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. The slight surprise of someone whose coding had been noticed. "My grandmother called me Tommy. When I was a kid." He paused. "It was the first name I thought of that wasn't my name." She sat in the chair beside the bed. "How did you know to reach me specifically?" she said. "I didn't know you. I knew the program. I knew the architect was listed on the documentation as a chief warrant officer who'd separated in 2016. I had a name. I had access to a search system through the medical facility in Germany. It took me 8 hours to find a current location." He paused. "You're a nurse at 3 different facilities under a per diem contract. That's not a hard paper trail if you know what you're looking for." "And the encrypted channel?" He glanced away. "Let's say I have friends who are willing to do a favor for someone in a hospital bed." He looked back at her. "I didn't know you were already inside the facility when I sent the message. I thought I was warning you to go there." "I'd been there for 12 hours. He absorbed that, looked at Dax again. The dog's breathing was deep and even, the specific quality of an animal that had finally been allowed to stop being alert. "Voss told me what you did," Reyes said. "The corridor, the records, the 3 a.m. thing with the director. Voss wasn't in the building for most of that." "He was watching," Reyes said simply. She supposed she should have expected that, given everything else. She didn't feel violated by it, which surprised her slightly. Mostly, she felt tired. "I would have come," Reyes said. "If I'd been able. I would have—" "I know," she said. "That's why you sent the message instead." He was quiet. Outside the window, the mountain ridgeline had gone the specific deep blue of late afternoon, and the light on the room's walls was warm and slightly amber. Dax's ear twitched once and stilled. "The protocol," Reyes said. "The 45-day stabilization. You wrote that based on what?" "Based on 14 documented cases of handler loss in working dog programs between 1998 and 2012. And on what I understood about the relationship architecture of the program. How a Line 7 animal is trained isn't just behavioral conditioning. It's cognitive bonding. When that bond is severed, it doesn't—" She paused, choosing the word. "It doesn't present like standard animal distress. It presents like complicated grief in a being that has no language for what it's experiencing and no way to understand that the absence is permanent." Reyes looked at her for a long time. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's exactly what it is." She looked at the dog. "He knew, I think, on some level, that you weren't gone. The grief was real, the behavior was real, but there was something in him that hadn't closed off entirely." "How could you tell?" "The way he responded in the corridor, the first time I sat outside his door before I ever entered the room. There was a quality to what he did. He didn't go further away. He came closer. She paused. An animal in complete despair doesn't do that. It contracts. He didn't. Reyes was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I want to thank you. You already did, she said. You sent the message. That's not... He stopped. Tried again. I mean, I want to thank you for the program, for building something that... He closed his eyes once and opened them. That I read once and that I'm pretty sure is the reason he's still alive, because you thought about what would happen when things went wrong. He looked at her directly. Most people who build things don't think about what happens when things go wrong. They think about the function. You thought about the failure. She looked at the window, at the ridgeline. She didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything clean to say to it. The protocol existed because she'd sat with the question long enough to know it needed to, and that was the whole of it. The thinking that went into it had not been graceful or systematic. It had been 3 a.m. on a different occasion years ago, in a different facility, after a different outcome that she'd been trying not to be the architect of again. The program had been built on something, and what it had been built on wasn't something she was going to put into the conversation right now. Get some sleep, she said, both of you. She stood up. Reyes said, Mara. She stopped at the door. Voss said there are hearings coming. Administrative review, the facility board, the IG proceedings. He paused. Are you going to be okay? She thought about Voss's word, inconvenienced. Yes, she said. She meant it in the way you mean things when you're tired and the adrenaline has burned off and the outcome is better than it had any right to be given the inputs. Not perfectly, but honestly. She went back downstairs. The East Wing at 6:30 p.m. was running its shift change transition, day staff wrapping, evening staff arriving, the specific low-level organized chaos of a handoff. Cole was at the nursing station doing his end-of-shift notes, and when she appeared, he looked up with the expression of someone who'd been waiting to say something and hadn't decided yet whether to say it. Solano's been escorted off-site, he said, about an hour ago. 2 people in plain clothes, not Devlin's team, different. IG, she said. She didn't say anything when she left. He paused. She looked... He seemed to be selecting the word carefully. Reduced, like something had gone out of her. Mara sat at the nursing station counter. She was aware of how tired her body was in the specific incremental way of having been awake for over 30 hours, doing things that required sustained presence. Not the foggy exhaustion of sleep deprivation alone, but the heavier thing that comes from being in a situation that demanded your full attention for a long time and having given it. I need to ask you something, Cole said. He was looking at his notes, not at her, in the way of someone who'd decided the question was easier to ask while doing something else. When you came in yesterday morning, did you know what you were going to find? She thought about how to answer that. I heard the dog from the parking lot. That's not what I asked. No, she said. I didn't know specifically. I knew the facility had a military contract. I knew there was a K-9 unit. She paused. I knew the per diem assignment had come through a channel I didn't fully recognize, and that felt, she considered, deliberate in a way I couldn't explain. Cole absorbed that. So you knew something. I knew something was off. I didn't know the shape of it. He nodded slowly. That's probably the most honest thing anyone said in this building in a week. She almost smiled at that. From somewhere upstairs, 2 floors up, in the rehabilitation unit, she heard something. It was distant and the building's soundproofing was adequate, but the East Wing corridor was quiet enough that it carried a single bark. Then quiet. Then what might have been a voice. Low, slightly rough, with the cadence of someone talking to a dog the way people talk to dogs when they're not performing it for anyone, just talking. The way you talk when you're tired and relieved and the thing you'd been holding on to for 3 weeks has finally let some of its tension go. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, the encrypted channel. A new message. She'd half expected it to be Voss, or Graves, or someone in an administrative tier she hadn't met yet with another requirement, another form, another deposition date. It wasn't. The message said, Mara, it's T. I know you're downstairs. Thank you for staying up there with him. He told me what you did. I also need to tell you something about the program, about why they wanted the documentation record of a failed Line 7 unit specifically. I found something in the communications Voss let me read. You need to see it. It involves your name. She read it twice. The second time she read it, she noticed what she'd missed the first time. Your name. Not the program's name. Not the Phantom Fang designation or the Chief Warrant Officer classification on the documentation. Her name specifically. She typed back, "What communications?" The reply came in 40 seconds. The contracting group's internal emails. The ones Voss pulled. There's a thread from 8 months ago. Mara, they weren't just targeting the program. They were targeting you, your departure from service in 2016. Why you really left? They have documentation of something. I don't know what. And they were planning to use it if the euthanasia operation didn't produce the outcome they needed. She looked at the phone. 8 months ago, she had been a per diem nurse. She had been living in a rented apartment in Denver and working rotating contracts and not thinking about Phantom Fang or Line 7 animals or classified training architectures, because she'd spent 8 years building a distance from all of it that felt, most of the time, like it was going to hold. Why you really left? She hadn't left because she'd wanted to. That was the thing she hadn't said in Graves's office this morning, or in the consultation room with Voss, or in any of the conversations that had framed her departure as a clean period at the end of an 8-year service record. She had left because someone had made her leave, because a decision she'd made during the program's development, a decision that had been classified and sealed and was supposed to be the kind of thing that stayed in a locked file in a building she no longer had access to, had been used against her, quietly, by someone inside the program's oversight structure, in a way that gave her the option of leaving cleanly or not leaving cleanly. She had chosen clean. She had taken her RN certification and her per diem contracts and the careful distance, and she had not looked back. 8 months ago, a private contracting group had started pulling on a thread she'd spent 8 years hoping nobody would find. She sat at the nursing station counter with the phone in her hand and the East Wing doing its shift change around her, Cole somewhere behind her entering his notes, the building settling into its evening register, 2 floors above Dax breathing in the particular deep way of a dog that had come back to something worth coming back to. She typed, "What documentation?" The reply took longer this time, 90 seconds, which felt like a different kind of time. Then, a report. Internal, from 2015. It's about a training incident in the Phantom Fang program. It has your name on it as the decision maker. And Mara, someone else's name is on it too. Someone who is currently in a significant position inside the DoD Contracting Oversight Office. Someone who would not want that report to surface publicly. She read it once. She looked at the wall of the nursing station. She read it again. Someone inside the DoD Contracting Oversight Office. The office that had authority over military program contracts. The office that had the power to determine which bids moved forward and which didn't. The 2015 incident report that she'd been told was sealed and would stay sealed had apparently not stayed sealed, and the person whose name was on it alongside hers had apparently spent the last 8 months working to ensure that if it came to light in a version that pointed at her and not at them. And the contracting group, the group that Voss was building a federal case against, had gotten their hands on that report and had planned to use it as leverage if the primary operation failed. A fail-safe. A pressure point aimed directly at the person most capable of identifying what they'd done to Dax. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she hadn't been aware of it since the corridor floor at 9:47 the previous night. She typed, "Who is the other name?" The phone showed the typing indicator for a long time. Then it stopped. Then it started again. Then Reyes sent her a single word and a title. She looked at it. Then she looked up from the phone, across the nursing station, toward the East Wing entrance where Devlin's officer was still posted, and where Voss had stood that afternoon with his laminated credential and his careful explanation of operational awareness and facilitation. Voss, who worked for the Inspector General's office. Voss, whose office had been running the parallel investigation for 4 months. Voss, who had known her name before he walked through that door. The name Reyes had sent her was not Voss, but it was someone Voss reported to. The name on her phone screen was Deputy Director Warren Holt. She sat with that for 30 seconds. Not because she needed 30 seconds to process it, Her brain had already done the processing, had already assembled the structure of it, had already understood what it meant and why it mattered, and what the next several hours were going to require. She sat with it because 30 seconds was the last time she was going to have, in which the situation was only as complicated as it already was. Then she stood up and walked toward the East Wing entrance. Devlin's officer, the younger one, whose name she still didn't know, was at the post by the door with his tablet. He looked up when she approached. "I need Major Devlin," she said. "Now. Not in 20 minutes. Now." He read something in her face that made him not ask a clarifying question. He picked up his phone. Devlin was in the administrative conference room with 2 members of her team, a laptop, and the organized intensity of someone 3 hours into a document review that hadn't finished producing things worth reviewing. She looked up when Mara came in and registered the expression immediately. "Close the door," Devlin said. Mara closed it. She handed over her phone with the message thread open. Devlin read it. She read it a second time, and on the second reading her expression went through a sequence that she controlled most of but not all of. She set the phone on the table and looked at her team member, the woman who'd been silent in every meeting Mara had seen her in, and said a name. Castillo. Castillo was already reaching for her own phone. "Who is Holt to you?" Devlin asked Mara. "He was on the oversight board for the Phantom Fang program in 2015, Mara said. "He had visibility into an internal incident that I was involved in. I was told the report was sealed at his recommendation." "Why would he recommend sealing a report that implicated you both?" "Because sealing it protected him more than it protected me," Mara said. "I was a chief warrant officer. Anything in that report that reflected badly on program decision-making reflected badly on me first. He was on the oversight board, 2 levels above me. Sealing it made the incident disappear from the official record. Except it didn't disappear. It went into a file somewhere, and apparently someone got access to that file." Devlin looked at her directly. "What was in the 2015 report?" Mara had thought about this moment. Not this specific room, not these specific people, but the shape of it, for 8 years. She'd thought about it in the way you think about something you've been carrying, not obsessively, but constantly, the low background weight of it. "There was a training incident," she said. "One of the Line 7 animals was injured during a protocol test. The protocol had been modified from my original design by someone in the oversight chain. Modified in a way that I had flagged in writing as creating a risk of exactly the injury that occurred." She paused. Holt was the one who approved the modification. The incident report as originally written made that clear. The sealed version, the version that went into the file, had been edited to remove the approval chain documentation. Devlin was very still. "So the sealed version," she said carefully, "made it look like the protocol modification came from you. It made it look like the injury was a result of my design rather than a modification of my design." Mara kept her voice level. "Holt gave me the option of separating from service quietly, with a clean record and a sealed incident report, rather than contesting a version of events that had already been edited at a level above mine. And you took the option. I was 29 years old, and I'd spent 2 years building something I was genuinely proud of, and I was being told that contesting it meant an administrative process that would take 18 months and that would hold the modified version of the report as the default record until the process was complete." She looked at the table. "I made the decision I made. And you've been a per diem nurse ever since." "I've been a nurse. That's not a lesser thing." Devlin looked at her. "No," she said. "It isn't." Castillo spoke from across the room. "Holt is currently Deputy Director of DoD Contracting Oversight. He's been in that role for 3 years. She was reading from her phone. "He has direct authority over the evaluation of contractor bids for classified military program support, including K-9 training programs." "So he had the motive to protect the seal on the 2015 report," Devlin said. "And when a private contracting group got access to it, they had leverage over him that they could use to influence the contracting process." "Or he gave them access himself," Castillo said, "in exchange for cooperation that served both their interests." Devlin was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Mara. "Is Voss aware of any of this?" "I don't know," Mara said. "He told me the investigation started 4 months ago. If they were tracking the contracting group's communications, they may have found the reference to the 2015 report. Whether they connected it to Holt, she paused. I don't know what Voss knows. Devlin stood up. I need to make a call, she said. I need you to stay in this building. Don't go back upstairs. Don't go to the East Wing. Don't speak to Voss until I come back to you. Is Voss a problem? I don't know yet. That's why I'm making the call. Devlin picked up Mara's phone and looked at it once more, then handed it back. Reyes shouldn't have sent you that thread. He thought I needed to see it. He was right, but it complicates the chain of custody on the information. She moved toward the door. Mara looked at her. The 2015 report, Devlin said. The original version, the one with the approval chain documentation intact. Do you have any record of it? She'd been asked that question before. Once. By herself at 3 a.m, in a different city, in the period after she'd signed the separation papers and before she'd started nursing school. The answer had been no then. She'd had no copies, no documentation, nothing that existed in physical or digital form that she could point to. She thought now about what had changed in 8 years. I have the emails, she said, the ones I sent to Holt's office flagging the protocol modification as a risk. Those weren't part of the internal report. They were in the program's general communication archive, which you would have had access to, which I had access to until my separation date, after which I didn't. Devlin looked at her. But before your separation date. Before my separation date, Mara said carefully, I was thorough about archiving my work. Something shifted in Devlin's expression. I'm going to need those emails. I know. Well, she didn't go to the East Wing and she didn't go upstairs. She sat in the consultation room, the same room she'd been in the first night, the same 2 chairs, and the box of tissues on the side table. And she opened the encrypted file on her phone. She'd kept the emails in an encrypted folder on a private server for 8 years. Not because she'd planned to use them, not out of any strategic design. She'd kept them because deleting them had felt, at the time, like agreeing with the version of events that had been imposed on her, and she hadn't been willing to do that even while doing everything else she'd been asked to do. She transferred them to Devlin's secure contact. Then she sat in the consultation room and did nothing for a while. The window in this room faced the parking lot. She could see the military SUVs still there, and a second unmarked vehicle that hadn't been there this morning, and the specific quality of a facility's exterior at 7 p.m. when the light is going and the institutional lighting is taking over. A few staff members crossed the lot, an equipment cart. The building around her was doing what buildings did when the business of the day had crested and was coming down the other side. She thought about 2015, and she thought about the decision she'd made, and she didn't perform a feeling about it either way. It had been a real decision made by a real person under real constraints. She hadn't been heroic, and she hadn't been cowardly. She'd been 29 and tired and looking at an 18-month process that would consume everything she'd built and might consume it anyway at the end. She'd made a calculation, and the calculation had a cost she'd been paying incrementally ever since. In the per diem contracts and the rented apartments and the careful distance from anything that would require her to be the person she'd been before. The cost was what it was. What she hadn't calculated, couldn't have, was that 8 years later she'd be sitting in a consultation room in a facility in Del Worth, Colorado at 7 p.m, and that the sealed report and the person who'd sealed it would turn out to be the mechanism that someone else had used to build a case against the very program she'd created. That the thing she'd walked away from had not walked away from her, that it had been waiting in a locked file for someone to find it. She was tired of paying a cost for someone else's decision. That was the clearest thought she'd had all day. Devlin came back at 8:45. She came in and sat in the second chair and didn't perform the entry, didn't set up the information in a way designed to manage Mara's reaction. She just said it. The emails established the approval chain clearly, in combination with the communication records from the contracting group's internal files, specifically a thread referencing the 2015 incident as leverage material. The IG's office has enough to open a formal inquiry into Holt's role. She paused. That inquiry will be separate from the contracting fraud case, but parallel to it. The Senate Armed Services Committee has an oversight subcommittee that Voss's director is already briefing. Mara looked at her. Voss didn't know about Holt. No. Voss's investigation identified the contracting group's operation against the Phantom Fang program, but hadn't fully mapped why the program was the specific target. The 2015 report was a reference in the communication thread that his team had flagged, but not yet located the source of. Devlin paused. When I called his director and told her what the source was, she was not pleased to have been briefed after the fact, but she moved quickly. What happens to Holt? The inquiry will take time. These things always do at that level. Devlin met her eyes. But deputy directors under active IG inquiry are typically placed on administrative leave while the process runs. He will not be approving any contracting bids in the interim. And the sealed report? The original is in a DoD archive under his office's filing system, which means it's now part of the inquiry's scope. Devlin paused. It will be reviewed. The edited version versus the original. If the archive holds both, which it should, given standard document management, will be reviewed. She paused once more. The determination of whether to unseal and amend the official record is above my authority, but the inquiry will make that determination. Mara said nothing for a moment. The emails you sent me, Devlin said, the flagging communications about the protocol modification, those establish that you identified the risk in writing before the incident. That's a factual record that exists independent of anything the inquiry determines about Holt. She paused. Major Graves has also been briefed. He's indicated that Special Operations Command intends to submit a formal statement regarding the integrity of the Phantom Fang program and its primary architect in connection with both the current operation and the 2015 incident review. Mara looked at the window. That's not nothing, Devlin said. No, Mara said. It isn't. Devlin stood. You should go home and sleep. I know that sounds... No, Mara said. It sounds correct. Devlin paused at the door. She was a person who used pauses carefully, Mara had noticed. Each one was placed rather than happening. For what it's worth, she said, the decision you made in 2016 was not the wrong one given the information you had. I've seen the administrative process you were looking at. It would have consumed 3 years, not 18 months, and it would have held the modified report as the operative document throughout. She looked at Mara steadily. I'm not telling you that to make you feel better about it. I'm telling you because it's true, and because I think you should know someone looked at the facts and reached that conclusion. She left. Mara sat in the consultation room for another 10 minutes. She thought about what it meant to be told you were right after being wrong long enough that right and wrong had started to feel like abstractions. It didn't feel like vindication, exactly. It felt more specific than that. Like a door that had been stuck for a long time had loosened slightly. Like the resistance had changed quality, not disappeared. She went home. She slept for 9 hours, which was not something she'd done in recent memory, and woke up to 4 messages. One from Graves, one from Devlin, one from Solis, one from a number she didn't have saved, which turned out to be Reyes texting from a facility phone because his own was still in Germany somewhere. She read Reyes's first. Dax ate this morning, full bowl, thought you'd want to know. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at that for a moment. Then she got up. The next 3 weeks moved the way the aftermath of large things moves. Not cleanly, not in a single direction, but in the overlapping and sometimes contradictory way of processes that involve institutions and lawyers and documentation requirements and people who have to make decisions about things that don't fit neatly into existing categories. The contracting group, formally identified in the IG's communications as Vantage K9 Solutions, a private defense contractor with offices in Arlington and San Diego, had their federal contracting privileges suspended within 4 days of the investigation, going above Holt's pay grade. The suspension was an administrative action, not a criminal charge, which meant it happened faster and didn't require the full evidentiary standard that the criminal case was still building toward. 3 of their principals were named in a federal complaint filed by the IG's office. 2 others had retained counsel before the complaint was filed, which told the investigators something about their awareness of the timeline. Mara learned most of this not through Devlin, who communicated in careful official language, but through Solis, who communicated like a person. Harlan Aldrich resigned from his position at Hargrove Medical Center on the 6th day. He didn't do it loudly. His statement to the facility board cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue other professional opportunities, which was the language people use when the alternative is being escorted out. The board accepted his resignation with a public statement about the facility's commitment to its military contracts and its gratitude for his years of service, which was the language institutions use when they're relieved something has resolved itself without requiring them to act. Devlin's findings cited the administrative decision pattern that had characterized his tenure on the East Wing, the access restrictions, the staff limitation requests that Solano had exploited, the 3 a.m. threat to Mara's credentials, without finding criminal intent. The resignation made most of those findings moot in a practical sense. They went into the record. The record went where records went. Britta Solano was formally charged on day 9. Conspiracy to interfere with a federal defense contract. Obstruction of an active military asset's care in a manner that constituted deliberate risk to program integrity. The charges were specific, and the evidence supporting them was extensive, and her attorney's first motion to exclude the facility communication records was denied within 48 hours. She didn't make a statement. Her face when she left the federal building in Denver was the face Cole had described. Reduced. Something gone out of it. Warren Holt was placed on administrative leave from the deputy director position on day 11. It was announced in a one-paragraph statement from the DoD Communications Office that described it as a precautionary measure pending an internal review. The statement did not use the word investigation. It did not use the words 2015 or incident or phantom fang. It was written by someone who was very good at saying nothing while technically saying something, and it told everyone who needed to know exactly what was happening while maintaining complete ambiguity for everyone else. Mara read it on her phone in the Hargrove parking lot and thought about a 29-year-old in a room with a sealed report and a choice, and about the specific distance between that moment and this parking lot, and about whether the distance felt like what she thought vindication would feel like. It didn't. It felt smaller and more specific. It felt like something being corrected rather than something being won. She went inside. Then, Dax's behavioral evaluations cleared the operational threshold on day 18. Solis ran the formal assessment and Mara was present for it, not as the evaluator, but because Solis asked her to be there and because Dax's response to the assessment was calibrated by the presence of the two people he most consistently oriented toward. Mara, who had sat with him through the worst of it, and Reyes, who was walking without the wheelchair now, and whose left arm was out of the full cast and into a functional brace. The assessment wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, which was appropriate. Dax moved through every sequence with the precision of an animal whose training was not just intact but active. Not the flat, rote precision of compliance, but the engaged precision of a dog who was doing something he understood the purpose of. Solis noted it in the report. Mara watched it and didn't note anything because she didn't need to. She just watched. At the end of the assessment, Solis looked at her notes and said, "Operationally cleared." Reyes was at the far end of the evaluation space. Dax looked at him, then looked at Mara, and then walked back to Reyes and sat at his left side. The working position, the position that said, "I'm here, I'm ready, I'm with you." With the matter-of-fact certainty of an animal that had decided something and didn't need anyone to validate it. Reyes looked down at him for a moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The ceremony wasn't large. Mara had been told there would be a ceremony and had expected something institutional, a conference room, a handshake, a plaque on a podium. What happened instead was that Graves asked her to come to the Hargrove facility on a Thursday afternoon, and she arrived to find a room that had been cleared of most of its furniture and filled with people. Soldiers in uniform. Doctors and nurses from the East Wing. Solis and her team. Devlin, standing near the back with the expression of someone who was there in a personal rather than official capacity. Cole, who had taken the afternoon off. Petra, who looked like she'd been awake since her last night shift and hadn't cared enough about that to stay home. Reyes was at the front, in uniform for the first time she'd seen him in it, the brace still on his left arm, Dax sitting at his left side. She stood at the back of the room for a moment, taking it in. She was not someone who processed crowds easily. She was not someone who processed being looked at easily, and the specific texture of being looked at by a room that had assembled itself around what you'd done was something she hadn't prepared for. She'd been so occupied with the process, the statements, the emails, the follow-up interviews, the care protocol documentation she'd been writing for 3 weeks, that she hadn't thought about what it would feel like to stand in a room where the process was done and the outcome was visible. Graves stepped forward when he saw her. "Chief Warrant Officer Weston," he said. The title. Again. "I'm still a civilian, Colonel." "You're the person who designed the program we're all standing in here because of," he said. The title is the accurate one. He didn't make a speech. She'd told Solis she didn't want a speech, and Solis had apparently communicated that, and Graves was a man who respected that kind of communication. He presented the Special Service Commendation, a formal designation that existed in the gap between military decoration and civilian recognition, issued by Special Operations Command for non-service personnel who contributed materially to the preservation of military assets and operational integrity, with a directness that matched what she'd asked for. He handed her the case. He shook her hand. He said quietly so that only she could hear it, "The 2015 record is going to be corrected. The inquiry has the original documentation. It's going to take time, but it's going to happen." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me directly," he said. "Not from a letter." She appreciated that more than she expected to. The room did what rooms do when a formal moment resolves. It exhaled, shifted, became something less structured. People moved. Cole appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of bad facility coffee and handed her one without comment, which was exactly right. "You look like you don't know what to do with a room full of people being nice to you," he said. "That's accurate," she said. "You're going to have to get used to it." "I'm working on it." He looked around the room. At Reyes, who was talking to Solis and whose hand was resting on Dax's head with the unconscious ease of someone who'd done that gesture 10,000 times. At Petra, who was eating something from a paper plate and looking entirely content to be standing in the corner. At the East Wing staff who'd come. Not all of them, but enough. "What are you going to do next?" Cole said. She'd been thinking about that. She'd been thinking about it in the space between completing the care protocol document and submitting the final interview notes for Devlin's file, and in the 9 hours sleep, and in the morning since when the shape of what came after had started to arrange itself. "Graves asked me to work with Solis on revising the transfer protocol," she said, "making sure the 58-page document travels with every line 7 animal from this point forward, making sure the facilities that receive them have trained staff." She paused. "And there are 10 other program lines in operation that don't have anything equivalent to the 58-page document. Someone built those programs without building the failure protocols. So you're going to build them," Cole said. "Someone has to." He nodded slowly. "Are you coming back to the East Wing?" She looked at him. "Would you want me to?" He thought about it with the specific honesty of a person who doesn't perform his answers. "Yeah," he said. "I think I would. It's quieter with you around, which sounds like it shouldn't be a compliment, but it is." She almost smiled again. She was doing that more than she usually did. Across the room, Reyes was making his way toward her. He moved through the crowd with the careful economy of someone whose body was still in negotiation with a recovery timeline, and Dax moved with him. Not pressed against his leg, not anxious, just present, adjacent. The working position, but softer. The position that said, "I'm here because I want to be, not because I have to be." He stopped in front of her. He looked at the commendation case and then at her. "How does it feel?" he said. She thought about it. She thought about what she'd expected vindication to feel like, and about what it actually felt like, and about whether those were the same thing, or different things, or something in between. "Like something that should have happened sooner," she said. "But better late than, you know." He almost smiled at that. It reached his eyes, which were still carrying the specific tiredness of someone 3 weeks past something serious, but it reached his eyes. "I read the protocol again," he said. "The full 58 pages. In the rehab room when Dax was sleeping." He paused. "There's a section in the middle about what handler loss looks like from the dog's perspective. The way you wrote it," he paused, the word retrieval lag she'd learned to wait for. "It reads like you understood something about it that goes past technical knowledge." She looked at him for a moment. "Every program has failures," she said. "The ones that make you better at the work are the ones you stay with long enough to understand. I lost a dog in 2012. Different program early in my service. I didn't understand what had happened for a long time." She paused. "When I designed the Phantom Fang protocol, I built it around the question of what he would have needed, if I'd known then what I understood later. Reyes was quiet. Did it help? He said finally. Writing it. She thought about that honestly. Yes, she said. Not in the way I expected, but yes. He nodded. Dax was looking at her. She crouched down and put her hand out, and he put his head into it with the same unhurried certainty he'd had in the kennel room on that first assessment morning. Specific, clear, no performance in it. She looked at him for a moment. Take care of each other, she said. She wasn't sure which one of them she was talking to. And then she stayed another hour, and then she left, because rooms like that have a natural span and she'd reached the end of hers. She walked out through the east wing and through the main entrance and into the parking lot, and the mountain air at 6 in the evening was sharp and cold with the specific edge of a Colorado fall that had decided it was done, pretending to be summer. She stood beside her car for a moment. There was a version of the last 8 years in which she'd stayed, fought the process, spent 3 years in an administrative review with the modified report as the default record and her own documentation fighting uphill against an edited version of events. She'd looked at that version clearly in 2016 and made the calculation that she'd made. What she understood now, standing in a parking lot in Delworth in the early dark, was that the calculation hadn't been wrong. It had been incomplete. She hadn't known that the distance she'd built, the rented apartments, the per diem contracts, the careful management of everything she'd been before, would turn out not to be a retreat, but a different kind of preparation. That she'd spend 8 years building the skills and the patience and the specific quality of presence that had let her sit on a corridor floor at 9:47 p.m. and make a dog who hadn't eaten in 7 days believe that coming closer was safe. You couldn't have told her that in 2016. She wouldn't have believed it. She'd needed the distance to become the person who could close it. That was not a comfortable thought. It was a true one. She thought about what Cole had said. What are you going to do next? And about her answer, and about the 10 program lines without failure protocols, and about the facilities that were receiving working dogs in crisis with inadequate documentation and staff who hadn't been trained in the right language. She thought about all the dogs that were Dax before anyone with the right background happened to be on shift. She got in her car. She drove back through Delworth in the early dark, past the strip of restaurants and the hardware store and the gas station on the corner that hadn't updated its sign font since approximately 1987. And she thought about the commendation case in the back seat and about Graves's quiet statement, "It's going to happen," and about what it felt like to have something you'd carried for 8 years start to weigh less. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like being able to put something down. And then looking at your hands, surprised by what's still in them. She had the care protocol. She had the emails. She had 8 years of nursing across 12 different facilities and the specific knowledge of what it looked like when systems failed the people and the animals, moving through them. She had the commendation, and she had Graves's word, and she had Devlin's careful statement. The decision you made was not the wrong one given the information you had. She had Cole's coffee and Petra's 30 minutes of slow paperwork and Reyes's single-word message. Dax ate this morning. She had Dax, who had come through a kennel door that should have stayed closed, and put his head in her hand, and decided something. None of it was clean. None of it fit neatly. She was still a per diem nurse with a rented apartment, and there was still an inquiry running on a sealed document in a federal archive, and the full resolution of the things that needed resolving was going to take time that she wasn't going to be able to hurry. But she was done paying for someone else's decision. That was the thing she took out of the parking lot and carried home. Not the commendation, though she'd put that on a shelf where she could see it. Not the vindication speech she'd never gotten and hadn't needed. Not the image of Aldrich's resignation or Solano's arrested face or the one-paragraph DOD statement that said everything by saying nothing. Just that. She was done. And in the space that freed up, the space that 8 years of managed distance and careful restraint had been occupying, there was room now for what came next. The 10 programs without failure protocols, the facilities that needed training, the work that only got done when the person who understood it was willing to stand back up and do it. She pulled into her parking space and sat in the car for a moment. The quiet they talked about, the kind they wrote about in military commendations and civilian profiles, and the kind of stories that got told after the fact, when the danger was resolved and the outcomes were known. That quiet